Chapter 20, The Imperial Republic. There was a new concept called New Manifest Destiny. The U.S. wanted to acquire colonies to expand their markets. There was imperialist fever throughout the world. The U.S. didn't want to be left out. They used the idea of social Darwinism to justify this, saying that the strong nations should dominate the weak ones. John Fiske said that the English-speaking people will control everyone else. Josiah Strong said that the Anglo-Saxon race is divinely commissioned to spread Christianity and liberty. John W. Burgess said that the Anglo-Saxons had high political talents so they can uplift less fortunate people. Alfred Thayer Mahan said that the greatness of the United States depends on its sea power. James G. Blaine wanted to expand American influence in Latin America. So these were all their reasonings for wanting to expand. The Pan American Union was a weak international organization for distributing information to member nations. There was a dispute over the Venezuela and British Guiana border. The U.S. accuses Britain of violating the Monroe Doctrine, and Britain agrees to arbitration. There's an increasing American presence in Hawaii, and initially bringing disease and missionaries, and they kind of destroyed the Hawaiian culture. They had a sugar plantation economy in Hawaii. However, the Hawaiians protested their subordination. The U.S. takes sugar out of their trade, so that's the only way to recover was to join the United States. So in 1898, Hawaii was annexed into the Union. Then the United States wants to harbor at Pago Pago in Samoa. So they create a three-nation protectorate between U.S., Great Britain, and Germany over the island. However, still U.S. maintained control over Pago Pago. Then we have war with Spain. So Cuba was fighting for independence. However, and now they're rebelling. And the Spanish used brutal concentration camps to try to control them. The American press sensationalizes the news, and it leads people to believe that everything that was going on there was the Spaniards' fault. However, there was brutality on all sides. So Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, with their newspapers, engaged in a ruthless circulation war. They both sent reporters and illustrators to Cuba to account for the Spanish atrocities. Cleveland proclaims neutrality, and McKinley protests Spain's inhuman conduct. There's a private letter written by Spanish minister de Lome, and someone turned it over to America, and it ended up criticizing President McKinley, so this causes anger in the United States. The American ship, the Maine, blows up in Cuba's harbor, so the Spanish are blamed, even though it wasn't their fault. So the Spanish concessions at this point don't satisfy American demands. Everybody wants a war. So there's a Congressional Declaration of War. And the war that started was known as the Splendid Little War because everyone supported it. It was over in a few months. The reason why it was called the Splendid Little War is because it was over in a few months. Few Americans died, and there were many more Cubans that died rather than Americans. However, there were difficulties such as shortage of ammunition, medicine, and food, and inefficient mobilization. There were also racial conflicts with the blacks in the army. Both American and Cuban armies were, well, the American army was segregated, but the Cuban army was integrated with the blacks. Secretary of Navy Theodore Roosevelt tells George Dewey to attack the Philippines in the event of war, so George Dewey leads Americans to victory, destroying the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay. So, back to Cuba, General William R. Shafter defeats Spanish forces at Los Guasimas, El Caray, and especially San Juan Hill. Theodore Roosevelt leads the Rough Riders up Kettle Hill, which was part of the San Juan Hill battle. America destroys the Spanish fleet and takes Santiago. So, there was an armistice to end the war, which ended in the independence of Cuba, and Spanish cedes Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S. Puerto Rico was a part of the Spanish Empire, and so they resisted Spanish rule. Then there was a transfer of power to the U.S. The Foraker Act ends military rule and established a colonial government. Then the Jones Act declares Puerto Rico to be U.S. territory and made all Puerto Ricans American citizens. There's also a sugar economy flourishing in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico becomes dependent on imported food and becomes part of the international commerce economy. However, the Philippines was more difficult than Puerto Rico. McKinley accepts responsibility for the islands. Some people want independence, and other people want Philippines to have relations with the U.S. America demands the islands from Spain, at first rejected, but when the U.S. offered $20 million, it changed their mind. The Anti-Imperialist League was a powerful movement that was against imperialism. Not everybody wanted to be imperialists. So they opposed annexation of the Philippines. The supporters of annexation supported it because they could profit, they had a dominance of trade, partisan advantages, and the apparent ease of the situation. So toward the Philippines, it was similar to the policies toward the Indians, like treating people as independents rather than citizens. One anti-imperialist, William Jennings Bryan, actually supported annexation, so it'll be an issue when he runs for president again. However, America votes in favor of imperialism when they elect McKinley, whose vice president was Roosevelt. The Republic as Empire. Some of the U.S. property becomes territories such as Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico, and the U.S. prepares Cuba for independence. The Platt Amendment gives the U.S. control of foreign policy and the right to intervene to protect their freedoms, permitting U.S. naval stations, etc. This only gave Cuba nominal political independence. America also dominates the Cuban economy, and military intervention puts down revolts. However, subjugation requires strength and brutality, so this leads to a war with the rebels in the Philippines. The rebels are led by Emilio Aguinaldo, and as the war goes on, America's become more brutal and savage. In 1902, the rebellion exhausted American control over the islands, and Americans began preparing the Philippines for independence and autonomy. Its first civilian governor is William Howard Taft, who will later be president. The Philippines is also almost completely dependent on American markets. there's increasing interest in China. So various European powers seized Chinese territory. So McKinley's open door notes, which are actually written by John Hay, allowed America to trade freely with the Chinese without interference or having to use the military. Not everyone approves, but John Hay says they did. So then there's the Chinese Boxer Rebellion against foreigners, and America has to quell the rebellion. This leads to more support for the open door policy, and America still has access to Chinese trade. McKinley gets Elihu Root to overhaul the armed forces. This increased the Army imposed standards for the National Guard, officer training, and a central planning agency, leading to a more modern military system. So this is the beginning and end of American territorial imperialism. Next time we will be talking about progressives and reform.